What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect. In this video, I'm going to be showing how you can create some advanced destruction inside of Blender utilizing the KHAOS add-on and a rigid body constraint organization system. We're going to be destroying this house here, and I'll put a link to a free download of this house in the description below, but of course you can apply these concepts to other 3D assets as well. But one thing I do recommend you do is, as you can see here, just divide your house or whatever object you are destroying into different collections of the different elements of the house. So for example, you can see that I have some interior beams here, just separated so that we can kind of fracture these in different ways. So it's not just one object, but rather organized into different collections of each individual piece. But anyways guys, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is actually create a wrecking ball that's going to destroy our house here. So to do that, I'll just put our 3D cursor up here. I'll press Shift A and we'll add a torus. And this should be pretty good. I might bring down the minor radius a bit here, maybe 0.15. So it's a smaller chain here. And I'll rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees, like so. And we're going to use this to make our chain. So I'll press Shift D, duplicate it, grab it, bring it down here, just so it's another link in the chain, rotate it on the z-axis 90 degrees. And now I'll select both of these, press Shift D, duplicate them, and drag them down a little bit more. And now we have two more links in the chain. And now we'll select all four of these, Shift D, duplicate, bring these down here until we have a chain that's long enough. So I'll just repeat this process a few more times. And make sure that none of your chain links are touching each other. They should just be close. All right, so I think this chain should be long enough here. Now what I want to do is select our last chain, and I'll go into edit mode here, and I'll press Shift A. We'll add a UV sphere, and we'll just put this UV sphere on our last chain link here and scale it up to make this our wrecking ball. And now we have something like this. So now we'll go back into object mode, and now it's time to make these rigid bodies. So I'll select all of them here, and I'll go to rigid body, add active, and then that's going to add the active object as a rigid body. And then we also want to go to rigid body and then copy from active. And now as you can see here, if we go to our physics properties tab, we have dynamic rigid bodies here. We do have the shape as convex hull. We want to change this actually to mesh. And you can see here now, if we play through our scene, actually we need to first, before we play through our scene, copy again our rigid body settings here so that all of them have the shape of mesh. So now if we play through our scene, you can see that our wrecking ball is falling, which is what we want. However, we do want this top link to be static. So we'll go ahead and go to its rigid body settings and deselect the dynamic option. And now as you can see here, if we play through our scene, it actually acts as a wrecking ball should, where the top chain link is holding everything in place. So now what we can do, now that we have our wrecking ball set up, is kind of position it so it will swing through the building. So I'm going to have it swing through the front portion of our house here. So I'll just go kind of in front view here, drag it down, something like this I think, rotate it around here, drag it over this way, probably something like this should be pretty good. All right, so now we want to rotate the wrecking ball up. So I'll take our 3D cursor selection here, and I'll select the 3D cursor where that first link is. And now what we can do is actually select to rotate around the 3D cursor here. So select this, and when all of our wrecking ball is selected, we can actually just rotate it up here, and it'll rotate around our 3D cursor. And it's not perfect right now, but just kind of dial it in as best you can, and let's go ahead and test it out really quick. So just play through our scene. All right, so we have some sort of rigid body simulation here. Before we start shattering our house, I want to actually add some mass to our wrecking ball. So I'll go to the KHAOS tab here, scroll down here to our active rigid body tab, and for the mass here, I'm going to change this to steel. And what that's going to do is whatever is selected at the moment, Blender is going to calculate the mass based on that material. So you can see the mass here is changed, and each object will be a little bit different. So let's go ahead and make sure that it's still playing back correctly here, because sometimes chains will break if it's too heavy, but it looks like it's actually working pretty well. All right, so now that we have our wrecking ball, it's time to fracture and add our house as a rigid body as well. We're going to be using the KHAOS tab here to organize our rigid bodies and constraints. So my workflow is going to be fairly linear here. I'm going to start at the interior portions of the house, fracture those elements, and then slowly work my way out to the cinder block exterior. And then finally at the end, we'll add constraints to bind everything together. You can see I have a variety of different collections here. I'm going to start with the base interior beam structure. So I'll just kind of turn off everything else except for those. So we have this kind of structure here, and what I want to do is fracture mostly the area where the wrecking ball is going to come through the front of the house here. So kind of this area right here. And to do that, first thing I'm going to do before I forget is actually name our project that we're going to use KHAOS with. This is going to be the naming convention whenever we fracture an object through this menu system. So I'm just going to call this KHAOS Destruction. And now whenever we fracture something with this name, it's going to create a collection for it, KHAOS Destruction 01, KHAOS Destruction 02, and it will organize things together fairly nicely, and we can select it and come back to it nicely as well. So now I will go to this drawing tab here and use the annotation tool to draw a fracture place. And this menu system is actually using self-fracture to fracture the object. We're just kind of conveniently placed it here for you with a variety of different settings. So go ahead and draw the fracture place. I'll just kind of make some annotations here where we want most of the fractures to be. So something like this, I think. And now I'll click on, we want to define our source limit. So the higher we put this, the more pieces our object is going to be fractured into. So I'm going to go with something like maybe 150. And recursion allows us to fracture again the object if we want to fracture this multiple times to create smaller pieces. But I'm going to leave that at 0 for the case of this tutorial. Make sure our roof interior beams are selected here, and then I'll click on fracture from drawing. Now, as you can see here, Blender is fracturing mostly where we drew those annotations. All right, so now as you can see here, we have a variety of different fractured elements here, and KHAOS has organized these fractured elements into a collection called KHAOS Destruction 001. Now, the original object, in case you ever want to go back to your original object, and maybe if you're getting some glitches, you want to start over, KHAOS has created a collection for your original object called KHAOS Original Object, and you can see it right here that it's just the actual original piece of the house here. So we'll keep that disabled for now, but just so you know, whenever you're fracturing something, KHAOS is going to put it into this little collection here in case you want to troubleshoot with your rigid body system. Because as we know, sometimes in Blender, rigid bodies have glitches, and sometimes the simplest solution is just going back to square one, resetting your cache, and starting a little bit earlier. But anyways, now we have created our first collection here, and we can select this fractured collection by itself by just clicking on this select button. And whenever we fracture more elements within this KHAOS menu system, we'll be able to select them in the drop-down menu as well. But anyways, now what we want to do is add these as rigid bodies so that the wrecking ball will actually interact with them. So I'll go ahead and select them all here and add them as rigid bodies right here with this button. Now, as you can see here, if we open up our physics properties on the right tab here, you'll notice that Blender has made all of our selected fractured objects rigid bodies with these same settings. And I do recommend that you have your physics properties tab open when you're making adjustments within this KHAOS menu system as well, because sometimes if they don't match, you can actually identify that quicker. So we want to start these deactivated, and what that's going to do, as you can see here, if I go down here to dynamics, you'll notice that now this deactivation is selected. So now the rigid bodies aren't going to move until that wrecking ball hits them. So as you can see here, let's go ahead and play through it just so you guys get an idea of what's going to occur. You can see that as soon as that wrecking ball hits the object, those rigid bodies start to simulate. However, they don't simulate in the most realistic way. So what we actually want to do in the course of fracturing these internal elements all the way to the exterior elements of this house is actually constrain each element by itself. So I'm going to scroll down here to our constraint tab, and we're going to switch the connection pattern to chain distance. And now we're going to kind of glue these wood beams together. So I'll go ahead, and actually before we do that, I want to calculate the mass of this structure with our drop down menu here. So I'll go ahead and select this collection, and then I want to change the mass to timber. And now you can see the mass is 102 kilograms, which is much lower than the mass of steel, obviously. So we want to make sure that for the course of the project, this stays as timber for the most part, other than the glass elements and such. But that should give us a more realistic simulation. But anyways, to continue with our constraint system, we want to keep chain distance on, and let's go ahead and select our wood structure here and click on Create Constraint. And now, as you can see here, Blender has created some constraints that are holding our rigid bodies together. So let's go ahead and adjust a few of our settings here. I'm going to make these constraints breakable, and I'm going to make the threshold where they will break a little bit higher. So maybe something like 2000. And now let's go ahead and play through our simulation and see what we're getting. And before we do that, if you don't want to see your actual constraint empties here, you can just go up here to this little drop-down menu and deselect the extras and relationship lines checkbox. And now we can play through it without seeing the actual constraints themselves. All right, so as you can see here, the structure of our building is being glued together quite nicely with a threshold of 2000. We could, of course, adjust this a bit, and feel free to adjust the various constraints you add to each of your collections over the course of your project. But I like to kind of make my workflow fairly linear, so I'm going to try to dial this in as close as I like for this first element here anyway. But I think this is looking pretty good. One thing that we're not getting in this specific case is our beams aren't glued to the ground at all. In order to do that, all we have to do is maybe just, select both the ground plane here, which, by the way, I should mention should be a passive rigid body. But let's go ahead and select that, as well as some of our wood beam structure that's near the ground plane. So we have something where the bottom of our beam structure is actually being glued to our ground, which will be a more realistic result. So go ahead and do that and create another constraint on this same collection. And now, as you can see here, we have some more constraints added, especially if we reveal them in our drop-down menu. And the cool thing now is that we can actually adjust these two constraints separately. So for example, you want to adjust the threshold of this second constraint that we've just added because the default is 10. It's going to be 10 unless you change it here. So that's why I recommend you always keep both of these tabs open. So we want to make these about 2000 as well, probably. Or we could actually make this not breakable. So you can see that when I change this, this changes as well. But by default, these settings aren't automatically applied to the constraint system unless you change them. So go ahead and play around with it. I think you'll get the hang of it, but this is the general concept. I want to make these not breakable. And of course, in the future, we can adjust the original constraint system as well, which is why this system is so convenient. It's just a nice way to organize everything. And now, as you can see here, if we play through our scene, let's see what we get for this rigid body simulation. So now this is looking a little bit more realistic just because the pieces are being glued to the ground a bit more. Now, one thing you could also do is actually make these rigid bodies near the ground, actually make them not dynamic or passive rigid bodies, so they won't move at all. But that just kind of depends on what you're going for. I'm going to go with this for now, and now let's continue our fracturing process with some other elements of the house. And actually, before we continue here, I want to organize our collections a bit better. So first of all, I'm going to select all of our wrecking ball pieces here and just move them to a new collection. We'll just create a new collection and call it wrecking ball. Okay, go ahead and press OK. Now we have a new collection with the wrecking ball in it, so our view layer looks a little bit more organized. And I also want to create a new collection here, and I'll double click it, and we're going to call this fractured house. Okay, and we'll actually add our KHAOS destruction -001 to this fractured house collection. So now we can put all of our different fractured elements in this fractured house collection and have everything organized so it all makes sense to us. All right, so now let's continue our fracturing and destruction process. So I'll go to our house for destruction collection, and the next thing we're going to fracture is our roof interior beams. So go ahead and add this to our scene here, and we're going to do kind of the same thing we did for our base interior beams. So go ahead and select this, scroll here to our KHAOS tab, draw a new fracture place, just make a little X here, something like this, maybe a little scribble so that it fractures mostly over here, and then I will click on fracture from drawing, and it's doing the same thing there with a source limit of 150. And now we have some more fractured elements. And before we get too far, I want to add this collection. I think it's going to be under here. Yeah, so we have to find our KHAOS Destruction -002 collection where these fractured elements are contained. And we're going to add this one to the fractured house collection as well. And now we have both of our fractured collections in there. And we can select this again in the drop-down menu. We can select both of our fractured collections right here. So if we want to select the first one, we can do it here, and the second one right here. And we can select that collection by itself without the constraints by selecting this button. And now we want to add these as rigid bodies. So I'll scroll down here, add them as active rigid bodies. And you can see that these settings are being applied here. Make sure the mass is timber. Make sure they're deactivated. Everything is deactivated, that's great. And now let's constrain our rooftop elements as well. So let's go ahead and just create a very basic chain distance constraint here. And I will make these breakable. And one thing we could do with these roof interior beams is actually constrain them to our beam structure that we've fractured prior to this. So we could just select some of the beam structure here as well and create a constraint between both the beams themselves as well as the actual structure of the house here. So we could do that, but I'm gonna kind of keep it simple here and constrain these together simply. So I'll go ahead and create it, and let's see what we get with our rigid body simulation here in a second. All right, so now as you can see here, we have another constraint system that's holding our roof beams together. We have the threshold at 10, which is the default, and it is going to be breakable, which is great. I do want to change the threshold to a little bit higher number, say 2000 again, since they're similar structures here. And I think I'm going to leave the constraint system as it is, but let's go ahead and play through our project just to see what it's looking like. Okay, so not bad. Let's go ahead and turn off our extras and relationship lines here. I think it's looking pretty good. Yeah, actually I'm gonna go with it because I think the roof tiles will have a lot less of a threshold to break, but these beam structures should be held together pretty strong because they are the base of the house. So I'm gonna go with this, looking pretty cool. We could add more constraints if we want to. And again, we can adjust any constraints that we have on our roof beams with this drop-down menu right here. But since we only have one of them, we can, just select it like this. But yeah, let's continue this process and dial in our look even more. So the next thing, I think I'm going to do the wood overhangs here. So these guys right here. And I'm going to, let's go ahead and fracture these guys. So I will draw another fracture place here. Again, mostly where our wrecking ball is going to be. And I will, again, I'll fracture this guy with a source limit of maybe 50. So not quite as much. Go ahead and fracture from drawing. And now as you can see here, this guy's fractured nicely. And we want to find this fractured collection. Let's see here. Oh, for whatever reason, it's actually under our KHAOS Destruction -002 collection. So we want to make sure to drag this guy just under our fractured house collection. So KHAOS is going to add your new fractured object to a collection under the active collection in your scene. So just make sure that you organize it after you've added each fractured element to your scene, because this organization is going to save you in the long run. So now we have this third fractured collection here. Let's go ahead and add this as an active rigid body as well with a mass of timber. And yeah, now make sure they're starting deactivated right here. And yeah, let's go ahead and constrain these guys together as well. So just go ahead and create a constraint on these. I might actually, for the sake of this tutorial, let's constrain these wood planks to some of our other beam structures as well. So just turn off the constraints here for a second and just select some portions of our beams here as well, just for fun. It doesn't have to be perfect. I think it's gonna look pretty cool. So you can see that we've selected our fractured wood overhangs here, as well as some of our interior beam structure. And now let's create a constraint right there. And now, as you can see here, we have some more constraints constraining those guys together. And we can again select it in the drop down menu. And I do want to increase the threshold of this guy as well, maybe to, we'll keep it at 2000 because it's kind of a similar structure. This is still kind of the base of the house, so we want it to be pretty strong. We'll go with this, and let's play through our scene and see what we're getting so far. I like it, guys. So of course we could, adjust a few things, but I'm gonna go with this for the sake of this tutorial. Feel free to take some creative freedom with your own simulations. So let's continue. Let's go ahead and work on our wall planks actually first. This guy right here. And I don't have a lot of subdivisions on this particular wall geometry. So I actually want to increase the subdivisions a bit, just because whenever you have more subdivisions, the fracturing is going to be more accurate, and the UV texturing on this specific element is going to be more accurate if we have more UVs. Essentially, whenever you fracture your element, you can get errors either in the UVs or in the actual fractured geometry. So the more subdivisions you have, the less errors you get. So go ahead and subdivide it a little bit, and that should resolve most of our errors. And now let's fracture it. So select it here, draw the fracture place, draw a fracture place, do the same thing here, like so. Have the source limit again, maybe 150 on this one. Go ahead and fracture this from the drawing. Let's see what we get. And awesome, now we have fractured our walls here. Now we want to, again, when I move this chaos destruction -004, go ahead and find that collection, move it to our fractured house collection, just so we can organize everything nicely. And now we can select all these here with this select object button, add them as active rigid bodies, mass timber, start deactivated, double check that in your drop down menu here. And now let's constrain them together. So I'm just going to constrain these together very simply. Just create a new constraint here. And now we have constrained these together nicely. Threshold is at 10, so let's go ahead and bring this up to, I'm gonna make this a little bit less compared to our beam structure, so maybe 1000 in this case. You can see it changed over here nicely. So just double check that. And now I think I'm going to just leave this as is. I'm not gonna add another constraint to this system. We could, of course, constrain the wall planks to the rest of the house as well. But let's take a look at what our wrecking ball is doing in our simulation for now. Yeah, I like this actually. Yeah, everything's being dragged kind of by the wrecking ball, and we can turn off these constraints here. Might make the constraint a little bit stronger here. I'll go actually 3000. Let's see what this does. Yeah, I think I like this a bit better. See, the pieces are staying together quite a bit more. One thing I will say is that maybe we can constrain the wall planks to the ground a bit. So I'll just select a few of these here that are near the ground, like so. A few of the main pieces. And then I'll also select our ground plane here, and then I'll create a constraint there. And now we have a new constraint. I'll make the threshold on this 5000. And one thing I should also mention, if you need to delete these constraints, or if you just don't want them anymore, you just select the one you want to get rid of, and then you just click on delete. And those constraints will be gone, and you can run your simulation without them. That's the reason we created this constraint organization system, is that it just helps you get the desired result faster. So let's take a look at this real quick. There we go. See, I like how these chunks like to stay in a bit more now. Very cool. So you can do that with other parts of the model as well, but that to me is what's going to give it a really interesting looking result. So just bind all of these guys to the ground itself. All right, so let's continue here. We have 4 collections so far of rigid bodies and their various constraints. Let's maybe work on our roof planks next. So add these guys in, select the roof planks. We might need to subdivide these as well. So just go into edit mode, select them all, edge, subdivide it maybe twice just so we get a more accurate fracture. Go to solid, and now let's draw our fracture place. Doing the same thing here, guys. So not rocket science. Once you get the general concept, you just repeat it and try to stay as organized as possible. So go ahead and do that, and let's fracture from the drawing. All right, so this fracture is looking pretty good as well at 150 source limit. And again, same process here, guys. Find our collection. It's under our roof planks collection because that was the active one we had selected. Drag KHAOS destruction -005 to our fractured house. Now let's select this guy, make all of them active rigid bodies, start deactivated, make sure they're deactivated here, timber, and looking good. I know I sound like a broken record here, guys, but it's important to check everything in these simulations to make sure that things are going to run correctly. But this looks good. Let's create a constraint. I'm going to create one with the same settings as our wall planks here. So go ahead and select all of our rooftop planks here and create a chain distance constraint. And now we have some new constraints here. Double check the threshold here. Default's at 10. Make it 5,000. So select it and enter. And let's just double check our simulation once again. Play through it here. All right, so this is looking pretty cool. So we'll go with this. Let's continue. Next, we'll do our clapboard siding here. So add this collection. This guy right here, same thing. We'll do draw fracture place. Mostly want to draw it where that wrecking ball is coming through. And make the source limit. I think 150 should still be good for this. Maybe just 100 actually. And fracture from drawing. All right, so we have fractured our clapboard siding now. Pretty good amount of small scale chunks there, which would be nice for the more intricate details. Let's go ahead and again, find this collection under clapboard siding. We'll add this KHAOS destruction -006 to fractured house collection. Go ahead and select it by itself with our drop down menu. Add them as active rigid bodies. Timber, double check the deactivation here, looking good. And for this specific collection, since there's not really anything holding them up vertically, I do want to constrain them to other parts of the house. So for example, I might select all of the clapboard siding as well as some of the wall pieces here, just for fun, like so. And I'll do the same thing over here. And perhaps even some of this rooftop as well. Just have some fun with it. Again, you can always delete the constraints and start over. In rigid bodies, there's a lot of experimentation. So I'm going to go with this. Now we'll create a new constraint here. So go ahead and click on create. All right, so we have quite a few constraints on our clapboard siding as well. Again, we'll increase the threshold here a bit. I'm not going to make it all the way at 5,000. Perhaps maybe we'll go like 3,000. And yeah, once again, let's give it a watch here. And remember, we can always view our constraints here as well. This is looking pretty awesome, guys. Clapboard siding is, kind of being stuck together there, but I think it's looking pretty cool. Now, a lot of our house is being taken away by this wrecking ball, which could be a nice effect, but what I might do at the very end of our constraint setup here is add some more constraints holding it down to our ground here. But I actually like how it's kind of being flung up into the air as well. But again, depends on your creative decision. But let's continue. So let's see here. We have 5 more different collections here. We'll start with the window frames. So go ahead and add this guy. Select our window frames. We'll make it simple here. Draw a fracture place. Let's just draw right here. Looks better. And we'll draw one right here. And source limit. We're going to make these not fractured into quite as many pieces. So maybe we'll do like 50, and let's fracture from drawing. So now we have fractured our window frames. Let's double check our fracture, make sure there are no loose elements or errors. and it's looking really good here. You know, not too many pieces, but enough to, you know, add some detail. And again, let's find that fractured collection. I think it's hidden maybe under here. There it is, KHAOS-007. Make sure this guy is just under the fractured house collection, again, for organization purposes. And yeah, let's go ahead and select it, and we'll make them active rigid bodies. Start deactivated, double check that here. Timber, and yeah, awesome, looking good. Now let's constrain these guys together. I think we can also constrain these. We could constrain them to the wood siding, but I might just leave them alone. I might just let them fall off the house, kind of constrain them together and see what happens. So let's go ahead and just create a constraint here. Let's see how our simulation looks once we do that. All right, so we have some new constraints here. We'll make the threshold, I'm gonna say maybe 1,000, not too much, just enough to break them apart, maybe even 500 actually. Let them break off pretty easily. And yeah, once again, let's test out our simulation. And again, we can turn on our constraints, or just our view constraints, and you can see how our object is being bound together, which is quite interesting. It's not necessarily going to affect the strength of the individual constraints, but it will show how things are being generally bound together. Let's go ahead and turn them off for now, and let's play through our scene really quick. Awesome, so you can see some of our window frame breaking apart there. I think that's gonna look pretty nice. You can see it falls off fairly easily here. But I'm gonna go with it, guys. Let's continue. We have window glass. This should be a fairly quick shatter. Go ahead and add this here. Select our window glass. We wanna make the glass fractured into smaller pieces. We do want to draw a fracture place though, mostly on this guy and this guy. Again, we could be more precise with it to get the spider webbing. So for example, we could draw it maybe in the middle of the glass, but I think this is going to be pretty good. Source limit, I'm gonna go we'll go actually something quite high, maybe 400, since we want them to be smaller shards. And I'm gonna show you guys how to add small scale detail with the debris system in KHAOS as well, but that'll be at the very end. All right, so let's go ahead and fracture this from the drawing. All right, so I attempted to fracture our windows here, and you can see that we're getting a bit of an error. So we're gonna try this again, and it's actually good that this happened because, well, it just shows the process a little bit better. So I'm gonna actually select the fractured collection here, and I will just delete this fractured collection right here. And I will go to our KHAOS original object. We wanna try to find the glass windows. There we go, this one. Move this to our window glass. Turn off our KHAOS original object for now, and let's try again. So I guess, you know, the reason we're having this issue, I think, is because we have this window frame that's intersecting with our glass. So this isn't actually the correct, like we had our window frames that we shadowed before, but now there's actually an error here where we have the window frame in addition to the glass, whereas we should just have the glass panes here. So what I'm going to do is I'll go to edit mode, and go to wireframe real quick. And actually what I'm going to do is I will make these isolated for now, just so we can view them by themselves. So you can see that really what we want in this model is just the glass windows, but not this actual window frame. So what I'll do is I will separate by loose parts. So now we should, let's see here, if we go back to object mode, we should be able to select this window pane. There we go, and delete this guy. So now we can select all of our glass windows here. Once again, make sure none of them are intersecting their geometry, and we will join them all together. And I guess the point of me showing this, and really the lesson to learn here, is that before you actually fracture your objects, they should be modeled in a certain way so that they can be fractured without errors. I have actually a specific video on that, but essentially the most important aspect of modeling for destruction, if you're going to fracture something, is to have no intersecting geometry or vertices. So just keep that in mind. Now let's fracture these again. So I will draw a new fracture place here. Right here, something like this, and let's fracture it, source limit 400 from drawing. Go ahead and give this another shot here. All right, so we have fractured our glass windows here, and now we have no glitches because there's no intersecting geometry. So this looks great. I should probably, you know, maybe have drawn our annotations near the center of each glass pane here so that there'd be some more spider webbing. So keep that in mind. We could redo it, but for the sake of this tutorial, it's already getting pretty long, so I'm gonna go with this. Let's once again add our KHAOS-008 collection, wherever it is. We got to find that under window glass. Here it is. Let's add this collection to our fractured house collection here. So drag it over here. Keep everything nice and organized and turn on our fractured house collections so we can see what we're getting once again. All right, so now we have our fractured house along with our fractured windows, which is great. We want to add our fractured windows as rigid body, so we'll select our KHAOS Destruction-008 collection and add them as active rigid bodies right here. Start deactivated as usual. Double check this right here. Instead of timber, we're going to make the mass, should be a setting here for glass. There we go, broken, glass broken. And we'll go with that. Scroll down here. We do want to constrain them a little bit. Not too much though, since glass should shatter pretty easily. So actually, you know what? I might not even constrain them. I think as soon as it gets hit, the glass should shatter. So I'm not going to add any constraints here. And we're going to continue our fracturing process. We have a few more different collections here. We're going to go with doors-001 next, which is just our door here. I'm not going to fracture this too heavily, but let's draw a quick fracture place, maybe right down the center. And source limit maybe 24, fracture from drawing. And now we have a nice little fractured door here, maybe a little bit too vertical, might be a little bit too much of a source limit, but again, we're gonna go with it, and you can backtrack and start over if you like. But let's find this collection. It happens to be under our door-001 collection. We're gonna add our KHAOS Destruction-009 to our fractured house collection as we have been doing in the past. So we have all of our KHAOS collections under this fractured house collection. And we're going to make all of these active rigid bodies. Go ahead and click on this button right here. And we do want to make the mass timber again, since it's a wood door. And I do want to constrain this object as well. So we'll scroll down here to our constraints. And I'm just going to constrain it together. Create a new constraint there. All right, so now we have created some constraints here. Let's make the threshold higher than 10. We're going to go with 1000. Make it kind of stick together there. And before we continue, I want to run through our simulation once more. I recommend you just, every time you fracture something, run through your simulation, make sure there aren't any glitches, because the last thing you want is to be at the end of your fracturing and constraint process, and then all of a sudden you have some kind of error, and you don't know where that error has occurred because you haven't tested along the way. So let's go ahead and play through it, and let's see what we get. Alright, so looking pretty good, no glitches, door is staying together nicely, so we can constrain this to the ground a bit later as I mentioned, but just checking for glitches, it looks good. Let's continue. So we got the porch, we have the roof tiles, and the cinder block exterior. So I'm going to start with the porch here, since that should be the simplest. Add our porch to our scene, we'll draw a new fracture place, make some drawings here, and source limit we'll go with maybe like 90, and fracture from drawing. All right, so we have fractured the porch here, and let's find our fractured collection. It's under porch here, KHAOS Destruction-010. Add this to our fractured house collection. Select our porch here and add all of the objects as active rigid bodies. Start deactivated. We'll keep the timber selected for the mass. And yeah, looking good. Let's constrain it a bit. I do want to constrain this one to the ground as well. I think that'll help our simulation quite a bit. Go ahead and select the porch as well as our ground plane here, and let's create a new constraint. So go ahead and click on create, and let's see what we get. All right, so we have a new constraint system here. Let's double check to make sure it's working correctly by just playing through our scene briefly as we have been doing. Actually, before we do this, we need to increase the threshold a bit. So make the threshold maybe 4,000. Make this porch a pretty strong one. Let's try it out here. All right, so our porch is collapsing pretty quickly, which I don't like. So I'm going to increase how strong that constraint is quite a bit. I'll select the constraint, and I'm gonna make it, I might just make this one not breakable. Let the porch stay in place no matter what, essentially. It's gonna bend and warp, but it won't break away, for example. Let's go ahead and give that a shot, see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm not sure what's going on here with our porch. It should be chained together pretty nicely, but I'm not sure why it's collapsing like it is. So maybe I'm gonna actually delete this constraint here, and we're gonna try to constrain it again. So Let's select it here. Select our ground plane as well, and maybe select some portions of this clapboard siding as well, just for fun. And scroll down here, we'll create a new constraint. Let's try this again. Alright, so we've added some more constraints here. Let's test it out again. Make the threshold 4,000, make it breakable. Let's see what we get. Hope this works a little bit nicer. Well, it's definitely buckling less. It's actually going with the house, so that's a little bit nicer. I might just crank this up a lot. I'm going to go with, instead of 4,000, 40,000. And now let's see if it is glued together a bit nicer. You can see the side structure supports are working a little bit nicer now. Still collapsing quite a bit at the top, so we could increase it more, but I'm just going to go with it for now. I think there's just so much force from the actual wrecking ball that it's really just breaking those constraints fairly quickly, even though it's all the way up at 40,000. So let's continue here. We have a few more different elements of our house to fracture. I think I'm going to do the cinder block exterior and then finish off with the roof tiles. So select the cinder block exterior here, and you can see our scene is getting pretty heavy here on my old MacBook. So we might have to not do quite as much of a source limit here, but regardless, it should be good. We'll go with a source limit of, say, 50. Fracture from drawing. Pretty nice little fracture. It's also separating them into their own separate cinder blocks, which is nice. We'll find our new KHAOS collection, drag it over to our fractured house collection, keeping it organized. Select our cinder blocks, add them as active rigid bodies, and we'll change their mass to concrete for a more accurate representation for the simulation. Make sure they're starting deactivated, looks good. And yeah, let's constrain them together. I will constrain them together, and I will also constrain them to the ground here as well. And let's click on create. All right, so we've added our constraints. Let's increase the threshold to, we'll go 4,000 again actually. And let's give it a play and see what it looks like. Cinder blocks buckling quite a bit. I might actually decrease the threshold on these guys. Well, you know, not bad. We want it to hold together some anyway. It's a pretty nice little destruction piece there. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go with it. It looks awesome. Finally, let's finish up with our roof tiles and then constrain everything together and add some even more small scale detail with our KHAOS particle systems. So finish off with the roof tiles here. Let's go ahead and add this in. This is gonna be really nice small scale detail that looks really cool when they're constrained together. So select those here, draw a fracture place, and because the roof tiles are already kind of little separate pieces, separate chunks of geometry, I mean, even though we've joined them all in edit mode, there are a lot of separate tiles that aren't intersecting. It's going to be fractured in a way that kind of keeps those separate pieces. So we'll just draw a nice little fracture with our annotation tool, and I'm going to keep the source limit pretty small, maybe even 20, since it's going to be fractured with the tiles in mind as well. Essentially, the more separate pieces you have in your geometry, even if they're joined, the more the fracture is going to break it up into their own separate pieces, regardless of the source limit. So anyways, let's go ahead and fracture this from the drawing, and let's see what we get. All right, guys, we fractured our roof tiles, and you know the drill. You can see that each tile is already its separate object, as well as some smaller chunks due to the way we fractured it with the annotation tool and everything. But this is looking good. Let's find that same KHAOS Destruction -012 collection that these roof tiles are contained in. We'll move it to our Fractured House collection as we've been doing, and let's select this collection, add them as rigid bodies. We want to make the mass maybe something like, what's something similar to a roof material? Something a lot lighter, I would say. I might even do something like bark. Go with that. Keep it starting deactivated, double check that, looks good. Scroll down here, we want to add some constraints. So how do we want to constrain this together? Well, I'd say we want this to fly up when the wrecking ball hits it. So we're just going to constrain them to each other. So just create a new constraint here, and we will adjust the threshold. All right, so we've added some constraints to our roof tiles here, and let's increase the breakable threshold. I'm going to make these constraints pretty strong, so maybe something like 5,000. Let's see what that does for us when we play through our simulation. see that if we pause it here, like these little chunks here are actually staying constrained together, and it looks pretty destructive. Nice little touch. And you can see the individual pieces don't want to break so easily when you have that threshold nice and high. It's like the whole roof is just going to be pulled off by that constraint system, which is kind of cool. And yeah, it's looking pretty nice. I just bring down the threshold a little bit, maybe 3000. And yeah, now we have constrained all of our individual shattered elements. One thing I like to do, in addition to experimenting with the constraint values and everything, again, remember you can just change the collection that you have your constraint in and then adjust those constraints on those fractured collections with the drop-down menu. But what I like to do, in addition to adding constraints to those individual fractured collections with KHAOS, is I like to just go to maybe the first collection here, or just essentially whatever collection you want to add some more constraints to. I like to do it to the first one just so I always remember that I have some master constraints in one of the collections as well. And I'm just going to select some chunks here near the base of the house where I want the house to stay more intact. So what I'll do is I'll just go into wireframe mode here, and I'll select the ground plane as well as some of the base of our building here, like so, and then maybe some of the roof up here as well. And now I'm going to actually constrain all this together and make it so this part stays more intact compared to the rest of our house. So I'll select all these, scroll down here, and create a new constraint, constraining this all together. Alright, so now we have added some constraints to both the left portion of the house here as well as the bottom, and we can just increase the threshold on these to maybe 5000 so that they'll break away, but only after a lot of force. And now once again, let's go ahead and just play through our simulations, see what it's looking like, to see if we need to make any adjustments, and then we'll bake our rigid body simulation, and then finally we'll add some small scale debris to tie everything together. Alright, so this is looking pretty awesome. As you can see, the right portion of our house here is staying much more intact, as well as the bottom, which is exactly what we want. And yeah, it's ripping off the roof of our house pretty nicely here. I'm pretty happy with this result. So what I'm going to do is now bake our rigid body simulation so that we don't have to simulate it every time we play from the beginning. So I'll go ahead and first save our project, and then I'll go here to our scene properties, and under rigid body world, I will set the simulation start at 1 frame and simulation end at 250. Then I will click on bake all dynamics, and Blender will go through and calculate the rigid body simulation. Alright, so we have baked our rigid body simulation here, and as you can see, now I can go to any part of our scene and Blender has baked the simulation into it. So it's looking pretty cool here. As you can see, the constraints of the system actually stop the wrecking ball, which is quite interesting. But pretty nice little destruction simulation here. One thing we're missing, however, to tie it all together is some small scale debris and detail. So what we'll do is we'll scroll over here to our KHAOS tab here, and we have a variety of debris to choose from. In this specific case, we could use glass particles, we could use rebar rods or rocks as well, or maybe even concrete. But I'm going to go with rocks in this specific scenario. And what I'm going to do in order to time the small scale debris correctly is just kind of scroll through our simulation here and find the moment when our destruction starts. So probably, around frame 70 here. And actually, before I go to frame 70, I'm just going to select the part of the house where I want the small scale debris to be emitted from. So probably around here should be pretty good. And I'll go to frame 70 when I want that small scale debris to be emitted. Then I'll make sure rocks is selected, and then I'm going to click on add debris. And now, as you can see here, if we go to the particle system tab, while we have those specific rigid bodies selected, we can see that this operator here has actually created some particle systems starting on frame 69 all the way through 79 that will emit small scale debris from those specific rigid bodies. So as you can see here, if we just kind of play through our scene, you'll notice that we have some small scale debris that's being emitted from the large scale rigid body simulation. So now what I'm going to do is just adjust a few of our particle settings to dial in the look of this small scale debris. So I'm going to bring the number of particles here down to say maybe 14. I'm also going to bring down the randomized velocity to 1, And that's just because I'm noticing that those small scale particles are moving a little bit too quickly away from our rigid body simulation. But by default, they'll be moving with the rigid body simulation because we have the object velocity at 1. So it's going to give us a very nice realistic result. I'm going to bring down the scale of these to maybe 0.04 or maybe 0.06. So it's pretty small scale debris. And yeah, let's go ahead and give this another shot. I'm going to start on frame 60 here, play through our scene, let's see what it looks like. And now we can see there's some small scale interactive particles within our large scale rigid body simulation. So feel free to play around with these different settings. Once you get something that you like, what you can do is just scroll down here to cache here, and then we can bake all dynamics. So go ahead and click on bake all dynamics, and Blender will calculate the interaction of this small scale debris particle system. And there we have it. Now we have added small scale debris to this rigid body destruction. And one thing you can adjust after you actually bake this particle system is the render size. So if you want to just slightly increase the scale of these particles, you can definitely do that. But this is the general concept here, guys. You can go to render view and take a look at it in its rendered form. And as you can see, we have a variety of small scale debris interacting in addition to our large scale rigid body system with constraints. And you can go ahead and render this out, add it to live action footage, depending on your materials, of course. But I'm going to end this tutorial here, guys. That is how you can create some more advanced destruction inside of Blender utilizing the KHAOS add-on, some rigid bodies, and the constraint organization system. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next on the channel. Subscribe if you're interested, and I'll see you next time.